Daniel was a small boy with thin arms and tired eyes. His hair was messy, his clothes were old and faded, and his shoes had holes at the bottom. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, he would take his violin, a scratched and battered instrument that had been passed down to him, and walk to the same street corner in his little town. He was only 10 years old, but his face already carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of life's hardships. People hurried past him every day. Men in business suits walked quickly with briefcases. Women carrying shopping bags chatted with each other. Children ran by laughing on their way to school. Nobody seemed to notice the boy standing there with his violin. They heard his music faintly, but to them, it was nothing more than background noise. They had their own lives, their own worries, and no time for a poor boy trying to play. Daniel had grown used to being invisible sometimes when he played. He imagined that the world was listening. He closed his eyes and let the notes carry him to a place far away. In his mind, he stood on a big stage, bright lights shining above him, and an audience clapping with joy. But when he opened his eyes, all he saw were people brushing past, some throwing him quick looks of pity, others ignoring him completely. His violin was not in good condition. A string had been repaired many times with cheap wire. The wood was cracked, and the bow had only a few strands of horsehair left. But still, when Daniel pressed the bow to the strings, music came out. It was not perfect, but it was filled with something no new instrument could create. It was filled with his heart. Daniel had no parents to guide him. His mother had passed away when he was very young, and his father had left one day and never returned. Since then, he had been living with his grandmother, who was kind but very old and weak. She tried to take care of him, but money was always short. The little money Daniel earned from playing the violin on the street helped them buy bread, milk, and sometimes even a little fruit. The boy knew that many people thought of him as a beggar, but he never begged, he only played, hoping that his music would touch someone enough to drop a coin into his small tin can. Sometimes the can remained almost empty even after hours of playing. On those nights, he would go home with only a few coins, and his grandmother would smile and tell him not to worry. But he could see the sadness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Daniel remembered the first time he had tried playing on the street. He was so nervous that his hands shook. People had walked past him laughing quietly. Some children had pointed at his broken violin, saying it looked like it belonged in the trash. Daniel had felt tears burning in his eyes, but then he remembered his grandmother's words, "Play with your heart, my dear. Even if no one listens, the sky will hear you." And the sky never forgets. From that day on, he played with all the strength in his little body. Sometimes, Daniel watched other children who were his age. They carried shiny new school bags, wore clean clothes, and walked with their parents. They laughed freely, their faces full of joy. Daniel wondered what it would feel like to live that way, to have a warm meal waiting at home, to be hugged by a father or kissed on the cheek by a mother. These were things he only dreamed of. But instead of letting the sadness crush him, he poured all those dreams and wishes into his music. There were rare moments when someone truly stopped to listen. An old woman once stood for a long time, tears rolling down her cheeks as Daniel played a soft tune. A young man once dropped $1 and whispered, "You'll be someone great one day." Those moments gave Daniel hope. They reminded him that even though most people didn't notice him, there were still a few who felt what he was trying to share. But most days were quiet. The world was loud around him, yet his place in it was silent. He was the boy nobody noticed, a shadow in the busy streets. Still, he kept showing up day after day, believing deep inside that his music had meaning. He told himself that maybe one day, someone important would hear him, someone who would understand not just the notes of his violin, but the story behind them. Until that day, he kept playing, invisible to the crowd, but never invisible to his own dreams. On a warm afternoon, the streets were crowded with people shopping, laughing, and hurrying to their destinations. The little boy Daniel stood at his usual corner with his violin. His arms were tired, but his heart kept telling him to play. The sound of his music floated through the air, soft and gentle, but most people passed without a second thought. At that very moment, a tall man dressed in a sharp black suit stepped out of a shining car. His shoes were polished, his watch sparkled in the sun, and his face carried the confidence of someone who never had to worry about anything. This was Mr. Harrison, a well-known millionaire in the city. He was surrounded by two friends, men just like him, wearing expensive suits and laughing loudly as they walked down the street. Mr. Harrison had a reputation. He was powerful, successful, and admired. But he was also known for his pride and arrogance. To him, life was a game where money and status were the only things that mattered. As he strolled with his friends, his eyes suddenly caught sight of Daniel, the boy holding his violin and playing quietly by the corner. He stopped, a smirk forming on his lips. His friends noticed too. One of them chuckled and said, "Look at that kid, trying to play music with that broken thing. Pathetic, isn't it?" The other nodded, clearly amused. Mr. Harrison tilted his head and studied Daniel for a moment. The boy's hair was messy, his clothes worn out, and yet his eyes were focused on the strings as if nothing else in the world mattered. The millionaire laughed, a deep, mocking laugh that made a few passers-by turn their heads. "What a little dreamer," he said to his friends. "Maybe he thinks he's some kind of musician. Look at him, playing to an audience of moving feet." His words dripped with sarcasm, and his friends laughed louder. Daniel heard the laughter. He glanced up for a second and saw the three men watching him. He quickly lowered his eyes and continued playing. His hands trembled slightly, but he refused to stop. Music was the only thing he had, and no amount of laughter could take it away from him. But Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his shiny shoes clicking against the pavement. He bent slightly toward the boy and said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Tell you what, little one, if you can play something truly worthy, I'll adopt you. How about that?" His words were sharp but filled with mockery. His friends roared with laughter. The crowd nearby turned their heads. Curious to see what would happen, Daniel froze for a moment. The word adopt hit him like a stone. It was something he had secretly wished for deep inside. To belong to a family, to have someone call him their son. For a brief moment his heart raced with hope. But when he saw the smirk on Mr. Harrison's face, he realized it was only a cruel joke. The man wasn't serious. He just wanted to laugh at a poor boy's expense. The people passing by stopped now. A small circle of strangers began to form. Some whispered to each other, shocked by the millionaire's cruel words. Others stayed silent, waiting to see what the boy would do. Mr. Harrison leaned back, still smiling. "Well, go on then," he said. "Show us what you've got. Maybe you'll surprise me." His voice was half playful, half mocking. The boy could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. His tiny hands tightened around the violin. Daniel took a deep breath. He remembered his grandmother's words, to play with his heart. Not for money, not for applause, but because music was the only voice he had. He stood straighter, wiped a tear from his cheek, and placed the violin under his chin. For a moment, the street fell silent. The millionaire raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting nothing but noise. His friends folded their arms, ready to laugh again. The crowd leaned in, curious. Nobody expected the boy to rise to the challenge. They thought he might run away or start crying, but instead, he closed his eyes and let the bow touch the strings. The first note that came out was soft, trembling like the whisper of the wind. It surprised even Daniel. It carried pain but also beauty. The sound hung in the air, refusing to be ignored. People in the crowd stopped talking. A man paused with his shopping bags. A woman froze with her phone in her hand. Slowly, the mocking laughter faded, replaced by something else. "Silence, mister." Harrison's smirk faltered just slightly. He hadn't expected the boy to even try. But here he was, standing tall with his broken violin, daring to answer back not with words but with music. In that moment, Daniel knew he wasn't playing for the millionaire or his friends. He wasn't even playing for the crowd. He was playing for himself, for his grandmother, and for the dream that kept him alive. With each note, he poured his whole heart into the strings, and the world for the first time began to listen. Daniel stood in the middle of the street with the violin pressed against his chin. The world around him seemed to disappear. He could no longer hear the laughter of Mr. Harrison's friends, nor the whispers of the curious crowd. His heart was beating so fast that he thought it might burst, but at the same time, a strange calmness took over him. This was his moment, and he knew he had to give it everything. The millionaire leaned on his cane with a lazy smile, clearly expecting to be entertained for a few seconds before walking away. His friends crossed their arms, one of them whispering, "This will be good for a laugh." The people in the crowd exchanged glances, unsure if the boy would collapse under the pressure or truly dare to play. Daniel tightened his grip on the bow. His hands were small, his fingers rough from years of practice on an old instrument, but they moved with certainty. He remembered the countless mornings when he woke up early, practicing before going to the street corner. He remembered nights when his stomach was empty, but his grandmother's words kept him strong. Play with your heart, Daniel. Play as if the sky itself is listening. The first few notes came shaky, a thin sound that made some people smile politely, but then, as Daniel closed his eyes and let his emotions flow, the music grew richer, deeper. Each note was no longer just a sound, it was a story, his story. The crowd began to shift. People who had been ready to laugh now leaned forward. Their laughter caught in their throats, replaced by a sense of surprise. The melody that came from the broken violin was not the noise they expected. It was beautiful, raw, and filled with feelings that no words could ever express. Mr. Harrison's smirk weakened slightly. He tapped his fingers on his cane, pretending to be unimpressed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. His friends, who had been chuckling earlier, grew silent too. Something about the music made it impossible to mock. Daniel's thoughts drifted as he played. He wasn't just standing on a street corner anymore. In his mind, he was on a grand stage, the lights shining brightly, 1,000 people watching, and every ear tuned to his violin. He played as though this was his chance to tell the world who he was. Not a beggar, not a boy in torn clothes, but an artist with a soul full of music. A woman in the crowd clasped her hands to her chest, tears forming in her eyes. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, listen, it's so pretty." A shopkeeper left his counter to stand outside and hear better. Slowly, the circle around the boy grew wider, more and more people stopping in their tracks. The sound was not perfect. There were scratches and rough edges, but that only made it more powerful. It was real. Every imperfect note carried the weight of Daniel's life. The nights he went hungry, the mornings he woke up cold, the loneliness of being a child who had no parents to call his own. As he played, he thought of his grandmother, sitting in their small room waiting for him. He thought of her tired smile when he brought home a few coins. He thought of her weak hands that always rested gently on his head. He played for her, for the sacrifices she had made. The millionaire shifted uncomfortably. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him. He had seen musicians before. He had paid for the finest concerts, heard the best symphonies, but nothing had touched him quite like this. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but this boy's music was different. It carried something no wealth could buy. Truth. The friends beside him glanced at each other. They no longer looked amused, they looked restless. Their laughter had died a long time ago, and now they felt awkward standing there, as if they had just mocked something sacred. Daniel's song rose higher, the melody grew stronger. His small body swayed with the rhythm, his eyes shut tight as though he were somewhere far away. The violin sang of hope, of dreams too big for a child his age. It cried for the love he had lost, but also shined with the belief that life could still be kind. The silence of the street was complete now. No one dared to speak. Cars slowed down, drivers rolling down their windows to listen. Strangers who had never spoken to each other stood side by side, united by the sound of one little boy's violin. When the final note lingered in the air, Daniel slowly lowered his bow. His chest was heaving. His fingers numb. For a moment he was afraid to open his eyes, afraid that everyone would laugh again, afraid that the silence meant failure. But when he opened his eyes, he saw something he had never seen before. The crowd stood still, eyes wide, mouths slightly open. Some people were crying quietly, others clapping their hands slowly as if they didn't want to break the magic. Mr. Harrison's face was unreadable. His lips were pressed in a thin line, but his eyes looked strangely distant, as if he were remembering something long forgotten. His friends were shifting uncomfortably. Unable to meet his gaze, Daniel said nothing. He didn't ask for coins, didn't beg for approval. He just held his violin close, knowing deep inside that he had given the best of himself. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel invisible, he felt seen, truly seen. And though the millionaire had mocked him only minutes before, the boy had risen to the challenge, not with anger, not with words, but with music that spoke louder than anything else. The bow touched the strings again, and the sound that came out was so soft it almost felt like a whisper. It was fragile, trembling, like the first words of a child who had been silent for too long. The first notes floated into the air, uncertain at first, but carrying something that made people lean closer instead of turning away. Daniel's eyes were closed, his lashes rested on his pale cheeks, and his whole face showed concentration. He looked as if he had forgotten the crowd, Forgotten the millionaire, forgotten even the street. He was lost in his own world, and through his violin, he was inviting everyone else into it. At first, some in the crowd thought it would be nothing special. A poor boy with an old violin could not possibly surprise them. But then the sound grew clearer, the melody forming like ripples in water. Each note followed the next, not rushed, not forced, but flowing naturally. It was not a polished sound, not like the trained musicians in big theaters. Yet there was something in those notes that none of them had ever heard before. It was raw, pure, honest. It was like hearing someone's soul speak without words. The noise of the busy street seemed to fade. The sound of footsteps slowed. Conversations stopped. Even the cars passing by lowered their horns as if they, too, had been caught in the spell. People who had been on their way to work paused. Shopkeepers stepped outside and children held their breath. The little corner that had always been ignored was now the center of attention. The first notes carried pain but also beauty. They told of cold nights when Daniel had shivered under a thin blanket, of mornings when hunger made his stomach ache. But in the same breath they spoke of dreams, of quiet hope, of love remembered. The music was both sadness and light. A woman near the front wiped her eyes. She couldn't explain why she felt tears at the sound of the boy's violin. She had heard famous musicians before, but never had she felt this tug at her heart. Beside her, a man who had been ready to laugh folded his arms tightly, his throat suddenly dry. Mr. Harrison tilted his head slightly. His mocking smile faded bit by bit. He had thought the boy would scratch out a few clumsy sounds, but instead, the boy had painted the air with music that made even him pause. His friends, who had been eager to laugh, now stood with serious faces, shifting awkwardly as the notes dug into their silence. Daniel swayed gently as he played, his small body moving with the music. It was as though the violin had become a part of him. Every time the bow slid across the strings, he poured out another piece of his heart. He wasn't thinking about money or adoption or the people watching. He was simply telling his story in the only way he knew how. The first notes turned into phrases, the phrases into a melody, and suddenly, it felt as if time had slowed down. Strangers forgot where they were going, forgot their own worries, and for a few minutes, they were carried into Daniel's world. A child in the crowd whispered, "It sounds like he's crying with his violin." His mother nodded. Unable to answer, she knew that was exactly what it was. A cry, but also a prayer. Even those who had no interest in music felt something. The melody slipped into their hearts quietly, gently, and once inside it stirred memories long buried. Some thought of their childhood, some of lost loved ones, some of dreams they had given up on. The boy's music reminded them of feelings they had almost forgotten. Mr. Harrison's hand tightened on his cane. His eyes narrowed, but not in scorn. He was remembering too, remembering a time long ago when he had been young and poor, when life had not yet been dressed in gold and diamonds for the first time in many years. He felt a sting of humility. Daniel didn't know this. He only knew that something inside him was pushing him to keep going. His small hands, though tired, moved with strength. His bow danced across the strings, carrying his voice to people who had never listened to him before. The first notes were supposed to be small, fragile, but in the silence they created, they became powerful. The crowd leaned closer, their breath slow, no one daring to interrupt. It was as if the whole world had stopped moving just to hear him. Even the city itself seemed to change. The wind softened, the air grew warmer. The street that had always been filled with noise now carried only one sound, the voice of a little boy's violin. And so the first notes that everyone had expected to laugh at instead left them speechless. No one could look away. No one could deny what they were hearing. What had begun as a mockery had turned into a moment of wonder. And as Daniel's music grew stronger, everyone knew this was only the beginning. The melody grew deeper, richer, as though Daniel's violin had found its true voice. The first soft notes had captured the attention of the crowd, but now the music began to carry weight. It was no longer just sound, it was a story. And every person listening felt as if they were being invited to step inside his world. Daniel did not speak, yet his violin spoke for him. The strings whispered of his childhood, of days when hunger gnawed at his stomach, of cold nights when he pressed close to his grandmother to stay warm. The melody rose and fell like the rhythm of life itself. Moments of sorrow, moments of hope, moments when dreams seemed too far away. The people in the crowd felt it. They didn't just hear music. They felt a small boy's struggles carved into each note. A woman in a red coat closed her eyes, tears rolling down her face as she remembered her own hard years as a child. An older man, who had once been poor himself before building a small shop, nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in the boy's sound. Daniel thought of his mother as he played. He barely remembered her face, but in his mind he pictured her smile. He let the violin cry for the love he had lost too soon. The notes stretched long and sorrowful, and people felt the ache of a child missing the warmth of a mother's arms. Then the melody shifted. It carried the sound of resilience, of a boy refusing to give up. The bow moved quicker, sharper, as if to say, yes, life was cruel, but I am still here. The crowd felt their own hearts beat faster, as though they were running alongside the boy, cheering him on silently. Even the children in the crowd were quiet, their usual restlessness gone. They stared wide-eyed at the boy on the corner, feeling emotions they didn't fully understand. But knowing the music was something powerful, Daniel's thoughts wandered to his grandmother. He remembered her thin hands, her gentle voice telling him stories at night. He remembered her coughs in the cold evenings, the way she tried to smile even when her body was weak. He poured her kindness into the melody, and it became soft again, warm like a lullaby. The listeners felt comfort wrapping around them, as if someone invisible had placed a gentle hand on their shoulders. Mr. Harrison stood stiff, his friends glancing at him nervously. None of them laughed now. The music carried memories none of them had asked to share, but the sound forced them to remember. Mr. Harrison thought of his own mother, a woman who had once sacrificed everything for him when he was a poor boy. For years he had buried those memories beneath wealth and pride, but the boy's violin pulled them back, raw and unshakable. The music grew stormy for a moment, sharp notes echoing like thunder. It spoke of nights when Daniel went hungry, of days when loneliness felt heavier than the violin itself. The sound twisted with pain, and people in the crowd shivered. Feeling that same weight press on their hearts, a young man whispered, "He's telling us his life," and the woman beside him nodded with tears. But then just as quickly the storm passed. The melody softened, hopeful again. It told of dreams Daniel held on to, dreams of a future where he wasn't just the boy on the corner, but someone loved, someone seen. The sound grew brighter, as though the violin itself smiled, and the listeners felt their own spirits lift with his hope. The music carried everyone on a journey. One moment they were standing in the cold with him. The next they were standing under the warmth of the sun. His story was their story too. The story of struggle and survival, of pain and healing, of loss and love. One man in the crowd pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. He hadn't cried in years, but the boy's music broke through walls he thought were unshakable. Another woman clutched her child tightly, silently promising never to take her presence for granted again. Daniel played as though nothing else existed, his eyes still shut, his face glowing with a light that came from inside. His small frame looked fragile, but his music was strong. It filled the air with so much truth that it seemed impossible to ignore. The longer he played, the more the crowd felt connected. Strangers stood side by side, breathing the same rhythm, their differences forgotten. They were united by the boy's music, by the memories it stirred in each of them. Even the air seemed to change. The city street that had always been noisy and full of rushing people was now calm, carried by the sound of one violin. The boy who had been invisible had become the center of their world. And in that moment, the music wasn't just Daniel's anymore. It belonged to everyone listening. It became the voice of their own hidden pain, their own lost loves, their own forgotten dreams. His memories had become theirs, and theirs had become his. As the melody reached a high note, Daniel's bow trembled. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He was pouring everything into the strings. Every hurt, every dream, every memory he had. It was more than a song. It was his life. And when the note hung in the air, lingering like a final whisper of the past, the entire crowd stood frozen. No one moved. No one breathed. Every heart in that place knew they had just witnessed something rare. Daniel lowered his bow for a moment, but his eyes remained closed. He could still hear the echo of his own memories in the silence. He had given them everything, and now the silence was their answer. The street had never been so quiet. Dozens of people stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the boy with the battered violin. Daniel's music had wrapped itself around them like an invisible net, holding them in place. Even the air seemed heavy with the sound. As if time itself had slowed down just to listen, some of the people in the crowd had come close only out of curiosity. A few had stayed because of the millionaire's cruel words. But none of them had expected this. They had expected noise, something clumsy and ordinary. Instead, they had been given a piece of the boy's heart, and now they could not look away. A woman near the front clutched her chest as if the music had touched an old wound she had hidden for years. Tears rolled down her cheeks freely, not from sadness alone but from recognition. The boy's story was not her story, yet somehow it felt like he was speaking to her, reminding her of everything she had lost and everything she had survived. A man with gray hair leaned heavily on his cane. He had walked past street performers his entire life without stopping. But this time was different. He felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he was young again, struggling to build a life from nothing. The boy's music seemed to reach inside and bring back memories he thought had long disappeared. Even the children in the crowd were silent. They didn't understand all the feelings in the notes, but they understood enough. A little girl tugged on her father's hand and whispered, "Daddy, he's sad but also brave." The father nodded. Unable to find words, coins began to drop quietly into Daniel's tin can, not out of pity but out of respect, one by one. People reached into their pockets, wanting to give something back to the boy who had given them so much. The clinking of coins mixed with the soft sound of the violin, but nobody looked away. They didn't want to miss a single note for Mr. Harrison. The transformation was the hardest to accept. He had arrived with laughter on his lips and mockery in his eyes. But now standing there, he felt as if the boy's music had stripped away his armor. The melody reached into the corners of his heart he had long ignored, the corners filled with the memory of his own childhood struggles. He remembered the nights when he had been poor, when his own mother had worked until her hands bled just to put food on the table. He remembered sitting in the dark, promising himself he would one day escape poverty. He had kept that promise, but in doing so, he had buried the boy he once was. Daniel's music brought that boy back to him. Raw and painful, his friends glanced at him nervously. They had laughed so confidently only minutes before, but now they shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the boy and the millionaire. They could feel the weight of the silence pressing on them, and for once they didn't know how to behave. One of them whispered, "Maybe we should go." But the words felt empty, because their feet refused to move. Something in the music held them too. It was as though walking away would mean betraying a truth they couldn't ignore. Daniel, lost in his playing, knew nothing of the storm building in their hearts. He only knew that for the first time people were listening, really listening. The world that had once rushed past him without a glance was now standing still. And though his hands ached, though his arms trembled with the weight of the violin, he refused to stop. The melody softened again, gentle and tender. Like a lullaby whispered in the dark, it wrapped itself around the crowd like a warm blanket. Strangers who had never spoken to each other before now glanced at one another with wet eyes, sharing something unspoken. Something had shifted between them. They were no longer just individuals rushing through their own lives. They were a community bound by one boy's music. Somewhere in the back, a man pulled out his phone to record, but after a few seconds he lowered it again, ashamed. He realized the magic wasn't meant to be captured on a screen. It was meant to be felt in the moment, with every breath and every heartbeat. The music continued to grow, Daniel's bow sliding faster, sharper and then slowing again, like waves crashing and retreating. The crowd moved with it, swaying unconsciously as though their hearts were keeping time with his violin. And then something remarkable happened. A group of teenagers, who had at first mocked from a distance, fell silent. One of them even wiped his eyes quickly. Embarrassed, the music had reached them too, cutting past the wall of pride and rebellion, reminding them of feelings they didn't dare admit. Mr. Harrison finally let out a long breath. His chest felt heavy and he loosened the grip on his cane. For years he had believed money was the only power in the world. Yet here was a boy with nothing, not even decent shoes, holding more power than he had ever known. With nothing but a broken violin, the boy had commanded a crowd, silenced laughter, and made even him, a millionaire, question himself. When Daniel reached the end of a long phrase, the crowd exhaled as one, as if they had all been holding their breath together. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy with emotions that no one dared to break. Daniel opened his eyes slowly. His cheeks were flushed, his body trembling. He saw the crowd standing there, motionless, their faces shining with tears, awe and something else, respect. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't invisible, and in that silence, everyone realized they were no longer the same. They had been transformed not by wealth, not by speeches, but by the music of a little boy who had poured his soul into every note. The last note of Daniel's melody hung in the air like a fragile thread, delicate yet unbreakable. The crowd was silent, holding on to the sound even after it had faded. And in the middle of that silence stood Mr. Harrison, a man who had always believed nothing could touch him, nothing could shake him. He had walked into that moment with laughter, mockery and pride, but now his heart felt heavy, as though the boy's violin had found a hidden door inside him and forced it open. For years he had told himself he was untouchable, that emotions were a weakness, that money was the only shield a man needed, yet here he was, standing before a little boy who had nothing and feeling more exposed than ever before. The smirk he had worn earlier was gone, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes unfocused as memories began to stir. He tried to push them away, but the music had already planted them in his mind. He saw his childhood, as clearly as if he had been dragged back through time. He remembered being a boy himself, not so different from Daniel. His clothes had been patched, his shoes worn thin. His father had worked hard, but money had always been scarce. His mother had carried the weight of their struggles with quiet strength. He remembered her hands, rough from work but always gentle when they rested on his head. She had believed in him, even when no one else did. Mr. Harrison swallowed hard. His mother had died long before he found wealth, and he had never given her the thanks she deserved. He had buried her memory beneath piles of gold, pretending he had made himself. But now, standing in front of this poor boy, he realized how wrong he had been. He had mocked Daniel for being small and poor, yet he himself had once been just the same. The crowd was watching, not only Daniel but him as well. They had seen the cruel words he had spoken earlier. They had heard his laughter, and now they were waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. His friends shifted beside him. Uncomfortable, one of them muttered, "It's just a kid. Let's go." But the words rang hollow. Harrison didn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, as if leaving would mean running from something he could never escape. He looked at Daniel again. The boy stood there trembling, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. His violin, cracked and scarred, looked far too heavy for his small frame. Yet Daniel's eyes shone with something powerful: courage, heart, truth. For the first time, Harrison felt ashamed. Ashamed of the way he had spoken. Ashamed of the way he had lived. He had mocked a child to impress his friends, and in doing so, he had revealed more about his own emptiness than the boy's poverty. The sound of coins clinking into Daniel's tin reached his ears, and suddenly his wealth felt meaningless. What good was his fortune if it could not create the beauty he had just witnessed? What power did money hold if a boy with nothing could silence an entire street with a few trembling notes? Harrison's mind filled with questions. When had he become so cold? When had he forgotten what it meant to feel, to dream, to fight? He thought of the boy he used to be, the one who had promised to work hard not just for himself, but for his family. That boy would have been proud of Daniel. That boy would have listened with respect instead of laughter. He realized then that success had not made him greater. It had made him smaller. He had wrapped himself in arrogance and pride, mistaking them for strength, but real strength stood before him. Holding a broken violin with trembling hands, a lump formed in his throat. He tried to clear it, but the weight remained. His eyes burned as though tears were threatening to break free. It had been years since he had cried. He had told himself men like him didn't cry, but in that moment he was no longer the millionaire. He was just a man confronted by truth. The crowd remained still. Some of them looked at him with judgment, others with curiosity. They were waiting for his response. His words earlier had made him the center of attention almost as much as the boy's music. He couldn't simply walk away. Not now. Harrison's grip tightened on his cane. He stepped forward slowly. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, and the crowd parted to give him space. He stood before Daniel, looking down at the boy who had done what no one else could, stripped him of his pride. Daniel looked up, fear and hope mixing in his eyes. He didn't know if the man would laugh again or scold him. His violin hung at his side, ready to be lifted again if needed. But Harrison's voice, when it came, was no longer sharp or mocking. It was soft, almost broken. "Boy," he said, his tone trembling, "you've given me more than I can ever give you." He paused, the words heavy. "You've reminded me of who I once was," the crowd gasped softly. They had expected arrogance, not humility. Harrison felt their eyes on him, but for once, he didn't care about appearances. He cared only about the truth that had been forced out of him. He placed his hand gently on Daniel's shoulder. The boy flinched at first, unused to such a gesture. But when he saw the sincerity in the man's eyes, he relaxed. "I don't deserve to adopt you," Harrison whispered, his voice almost cracking. "But I want to help you. You don't belong on this corner. You belong on a stage." His words were not loud, but they carried through the silence like thunder. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Some clapped, others simply nodded. But all of them felt the weight of the transformation they had just witnessed. And for Harrison, it was not just the boy who had changed that day. It was himself. The millionaire who once believed money was everything had been humbled by a child with nothing but music. The crowd stood in awe, whispering softly among themselves for a long moment. It felt as though the world had stopped on that single street corner. A poor boy with a broken violin had silenced laughter, stirred hearts, and even brought a proud millionaire to his knees. Daniel looked up at Mr. Harrison with wide, uncertain eyes. He could hardly believe the same man who had mocked him minutes before was now speaking words of respect. He clutched his violin tightly, not knowing what to say. He had never been given kindness from a stranger of such power. Mr. Harrison's hand remained firm on the boy's shoulder. His voice carried steady now, though his heart still trembled. "You will not be forgotten," he said. "Your music deserves more than coins tossed in a tin. It deserves a stage, a future, a chance." The crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't the noisy clapping of routine performances. It was slow, heavy, heartfelt. Each clap carried gratitude, respect, and the quiet admission that they had been changed by what they had heard. Some people cheered Daniel's name. Others simply stood with tears in their eyes. Daniel's grandmother, who had been watching from a distance, pushed her way through the crowd. Her frail body trembled with every step, but her face glowed with pride. When she reached him, she wrapped her arms around the boy, whispering, "I told you, child, the sky listens, and today, the world listened too." Daniel pressed his face into her shoulder, his small body shaking with relief. Harrison watched the reunion with a lump in his throat. It reminded him of his own mother, and for a moment, he wished she could see him now, not as the cold, arrogant man he had become, but as someone trying to remember what it meant to care. The millionaire turned to the crowd and spoke, his voice strong. "This boy has shown us that greatness is not bought with wealth, but born in the heart. From today, I will see to it that his music reaches beyond this street. I will sponsor him, train him, and give him the opportunities he deserves." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some clapped louder, others wept openly. For them, this was more than generosity. It was redemption. A man known for arrogance had been humbled by a child, and they had witnessed it with their own eyes. Daniel blinked up at him, too shocked to speak. His lips parted, but no words came out. Only a tear slid down his cheek. Glistening in the light, Harrison bent down slightly, meeting the boy's eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Daniel," he said softly. "It is I who should thank you, for reminding me of something money could never buy." The boy nodded, his heart swelling with emotions he could not name. He had never dreamed of such a moment, never believed the man who had mocked him could become his greatest supporter. From that day forward, life began to change. The news of the performance spread quickly. Newspapers carried the story of the poor boy whose music had touched a millionaire's heart. Videos shared by the crowd went viral. Soon, Daniel was invited to play at schools, theaters, and events, not as a beggar but as an artist. But Daniel never forgot where he came from. He still walked the same street sometimes, violin in hand, not for money, but to remind himself of the day his music turned strangers into family. The people who had once walked past him without noticing now stopped, smiled, and greeted him with warmth. They remembered the moment they had been transformed by his song. Harrison, too, was not the same. The man who had lived his life chasing wealth found new purpose. He supported not only Daniel, but also other children with talent and dreams. He built programs to give opportunities to those who had none. For the first time, his money was not just a symbol of pride, but a tool to bring change. The bond between the millionaire and the boy grew stronger. Harrison became a mentor, a protector, and in many ways, the father Daniel had always wished for. It was not mockery anymore, it was love, respect, and a promise to never let the boy's light fade. Years later, when Daniel stood on the stage of a grand concert hall, dressed in clean clothes, holding a new violin, he looked out at the audience and found Harrison and his grandmother sitting in the front row. His heart raced as he lifted the bow. He played, not for fame or applause, but for the boy he once was, the boy who had stood on a corner with nothing but a dream. And as the music filled the hall, stronger and more beautiful than ever, people listened silent and breathless, just as they had on that street long ago. The story had come full circle. The boy nobody noticed had become the boy everyone remembered. And for Daniel, it was never about the money. It was never about the promise of adoption or fame. It was about music, the one voice that had always been his. The voice that had saved him, transformed others, and built a bridge between a poor child and a wealthy man. The crowd that day had seen something rare, the power of truth spoken through the strings of a violin, and they carried it with them forever, knowing that sometimes the smallest, most fragile beginnings could lead to the greatest new beginnings of all.